The pine-choked valley was quiet, holding the kind of deep, cold silence that sinks into a man's bones. Seth McAllister rode easy, his gaze sweeping the ridgeline, his horse, a steady buckskin, planting its hoofs with care on the rocky trail. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the first real threat of winter. It was late afternoon, the sun already dipping low, casting long, blue shadows that swallowed the forest floor. He was alone, and preferred it that way. Then the quiet broke. It was not a natural sound, not the cry of a hawk or the complaint of a jay. It was human. A high, thin scream that ripped through the cold air, followed instantly by the flat, angry crack of a pistol shot. Another, then a deeper shout. Seth reined in the buckskin, his body tensing. He was not a man who went looking for trouble. He had spent the better part of 5 years building a life that avoided it. But trouble, in the Wyoming territory, had a way of finding you. He slid from the saddle, his movements fluid and practiced. He grabbed his rifle from its scabbard, the metal cold against his gloves. He spoke a low word to the horse, which stood ground, trained and calm. He moved into the dense timber, keeping to the shadows, his boots making almost no sound on the carpet of dead needles. He smelled it before he saw it. Wood smoke, sharp and acrid, and underneath it, the coppery tang of fresh blood. He crested a small rise and looked down. The trail opened into a small clearing, bisected by a creek. A farm wagon was overturned, one wheel splintered and broken. 2 men lay on the ground, unmoving, dark stains spreading across their coarse shirts. A third was slumped against a tree, his face a ruin. A small fire smoked nearby, scattered with kicked-over pots and spilled flour. Then he saw the movement, behind the wrecked wagon. 3 figures were huddled. Girls, no, women. One was a girl. They were bound, their hands tied roughly behind them. As he watched, one of them, the eldest, was struggling with the ropes on the smallest, her fingers raw and clumsy with panic. They had clearly been trying to escape, had perhaps gotten free once, only to be caught again just as Seth arrived. He stepped out from the trees, his rifle held low and ready. The eldest one's head snapped up, her eyes, wide with terror, fixed on him. She was perhaps 24, gaunt and hollow-cheeked, her brown hair matted with dirt and leaves. But even in her fear, there was a fire. She immediately shoved the other 2 behind her, putting her own bound body between them and the new threat. "Get back," she hissed, her voice a dry rasp. The middle sister, maybe 19, did not look up. She was staring at the ground, her body shaking in a steady, violent tremor. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing a dark, ugly bruise on her pale skin. She was gone from this place, her mind somewhere dark and far away. The youngest, no more than 15, was weeping. It was a choked, desperate sound. She clutched a small, handmade doll to her chest, its button eyes staring blankly at the carnage. Seth's eyes swept the scene again. 3 dead men, 3 terrified women, a failed ambush, or perhaps a capture gone wrong. He took a step forward. "I'm not with them," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, but steady. The eldest, Isabel, did not relax. Her gaze darted from Seth to the woods, then back. "Who are you?" Before he could answer, there was a crash in the undergrowth on the far side of the creek. A 4th man, alive, burst from the brush. He was wild-eyed, a pistol in his hand, and he was making for a horse tethered deeper in the trees. He glanced back, saw Seth, and raised his pistol. Seth did not hesitate. He did not shout a warning. His rifle came up, settled against his shoulder, and fired. The sound was deafening in the small clearing. The man stumbled, a look of profound surprise on his face, before he pitched forward into the shallow water of the creek and lay still. The youngest girl, Rose, shrieked and buried her face in her sister's back. Clara, the middle one, flinched but otherwise did not move, her 1,000-yard stare unbroken. Isabel, however, just watched Seth. Her breath hitched, but her eyes were cold, assessing, He was not a savior. He was just another kind of danger. Silence fell again, heavier this time, thick with the smell of gunpowder. Seth walked forward slowly, his rifle still ready. He checked the 3 men on the ground, confirming what he already knew. Dead. He walked to the creek and nudged the 4th man with his boot. Also dead. He turned back to the sisters. He took his knife from his belt and held it out, hilt first, toward Isabel. "Cut yourselves free," he said. She stared at the knife, mistrustful. She looked at his face, searching for the trick. He was tall, dressed in worn canvas and leather, his face weathered by sun and wind. There was no kindness in his expression, but no malice either. He simply looked tired. Slowly, she shuffled forward and took the knife, her hands raw and trembling, fumbled with the blade. He watched her saw at the ropes on her youngest sister first, then the middle one. Clara did not seem to register her freedom. She just kept shaking. Finally, Isabel cut her own bonds, the thick rope falling away from her wrists. She rubbed the circulation back into them, her eyes never leaving him. She did not return the knife. He did not ask for it. He walked to his horse, pulled his shovel from his pack, and returned to the clearing. He did not ask questions. He did not offer comfort. He simply began to dig. The work was hard. The ground was rocky and beginning to freeze. The only sounds for the next hour were the rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel and Rose's quiet, shuddering sobs. Seth worked without pause, his movements economical and strong. He dug 4 shallow graves, one by one, and dragged the bodies into them. He did not search their pockets. He did not say a prayer. He just covered them, tamping the earth down with his boot. When he was finished, he wiped the sweat from his brow with his sleeve, the evening air biting at his damp shirt. He looked at the 3 sisters, who had not moved from their spot behind the wagon. They looked half-starved, their faces smudged with grime, their dresses thin and inadequate for the mountains. "What happened here?" he asked. Isabel stood straighter. She had the knife gripped tight in her hand. "What does it look like?" They were filth. They got what they deserved. "Who were they?" "Scrappers, bushwhackers. They found us at a way station 2 weeks back. Took us, said they were taking us south, to a buyer." Seth's face darkened. He knew what that meant. He looked at Clara, at her vacant stare and the torn dress. He understood. "Where is your family?" he asked. Isabel's expression, already hard, turned brittle. "Dead. Our pa died 6 months ago. The bank took the farm. We had nowhere to go." "You were heading somewhere," he pressed. "An uncle," she said, the word like ash in her mouth. "In Laramie. We got there. He has a new wife. He said he couldn't take us. He gave us $10 and told us to go to the mission." She spat on the ground. "We were at the way station, waiting for a wagon east, anywhere east, when they found us. So, they were truly alone. No family, no farm, no destination. The world had chewed them up and spit them out, and these men had been waiting to pick up the scraps." He looked at the sky. The sun was gone. The temperature was dropping fast. "I can take you to the nearest town. Cheyenne is 3 days south. There's a sheriff there." Isabel's reaction was immediate and violent. "No, no towns." She grabbed Rose, who had started to cry harder. "Please, we can't." "You need food, shelter, the law." "The law?" She laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "What will the law do? They'll look at us. They'll see what we are. 3 girls, alone, no money. They'll separate us. They'll put Rose in a home. They'll put me and Clara to work. We know what kind of work." She took a step toward him, her eyes blazing with a desperate, trapped fury. "We know what men in towns do. We won't go to a brothel. We won't be separated. We'd rather die out here." Seth looked at her, then at Clara, who was rocking back and forth, humming a tuneless, empty song. He looked at Rose, clutching her doll as if it were the last anchor in the world. Isabel was right. A town marshal would see them as a problem to be solved. Not people to be saved. They would be split up, farmed out, or worse. He sighed, the breath pluming white in the air. This was a complication he did not need. His cabin was his sanctuary, a place where the world and its troubles did not reach. He had built it that way. He looked at the coming night, at the wolves he could hear howling, faint and distant. He looked at the three sisters, who would not survive 2 days on their own. "I have a place," he said, the words reluctant. "It's north, a 2-day ride from here, deep in the mountains." Isabel's eyes narrowed. "A place? What kind of place? A homestead? Just a cabin? It's isolated. No one will find you there." "And you?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You'll be there?" "It's my home," he said simply. She stared at him, weighing the options, the woods and certain death, a town and a different kind of death. Or this man, this quiet, violent man who buried his enemies and offered shelter in the same breath. He was a wolf. She was sure of it. But he was one wolf, not a town full of them. "We stay together," she said. It was not a request. It was a term. "I won't separate you," he replied. He looked at the wreckage. There was nothing to salvage. He went to his horse and untied his bedroll and a heavy oilskin tarp. He pulled out a spare blanket. "Clara and Rose can ride my horse. We'll have to walk." He helped the youngest girl up, then gently lifted Clara, who moved like a wooden thing, and settled her in the saddle. Rose held on to her, her small face buried in her sister's back. Seth offered a hand to Isabel, but she ignored it, pulling herself up to sit behind Clara, wrapping her arms around both her sisters, a fierce, protective shield. Seth took the reins and began to walk, leading the horse north, away from the trail, into the deepening wilderness. The journey was brutal. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against them. They moved through thick pine forests and up steep, rocky inclines. Seth set a hard pace, wanting to put as much distance as possible between them and the clearing before they stopped. Isabel, her pride forcing her to, had insisted on walking after only an hour. She stumbled often, her worn-out shoes offering no protection against the stones. But she never complained. She walked near the horse's head, close to her sisters, her hand resting on Clara's leg. Seth walked in front, his rifle in his hand, his eyes scanning the trees. He did not speak. He did not ask them if they were tired or hungry. He just moved, a relentless, steady presence. They stopped hours after dark, in a small, defensible hollow protected by a granite overhang. Seth built a fire with quick, efficient movements. He took a small pot, filled it with snow, and set it to boil. He pulled jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags. He handed the food to Isabel. She took it, divided it, giving the largest portions to Rose and Clara, leaving almost nothing for herself. Seth watched this, then reached back into his bag and handed her another piece of jerky. "Eat," he said. It was an order. She met his gaze, defiance flashing, but her stomach betrayed her. She took it and ate, chewing the tough, salty meat slowly, painfully. He made a thin broth from the jerky and melted snow, and passed the tin cups to them. It was hot, and it sent a shock of warmth through their exhausted bodies. Rose drank hers and, for the first time, her sobs quieted. She slumped against Clara, fast asleep. Seth laid out his bedroll and the extra blanket near the fire. "Take these," he said, nodding to Isabel. "Where will you sleep?" she asked, her voice suspicious. "I'll take the watch." He gestured with his rifle. "That tarp will cut the wind." He spread the heavy oilskin on the ground for them, creating a barrier against the frozen earth. Isabel hesitated. Then carefully, she settled her sisters down. She lay Clara and Rose on the bedroll, covering them with the blanket. They were asleep almost instantly, their bodies succumbing to an exhaustion that went deeper than muscle. Isabel, however, did not lie down. She pulled the thin shawl she wore tighter around her shoulders and sat on the edge of the tarp, her back against the rock wall. She still held the knife. Seth moved to the other side of the small fire. He sat with his back against a pine, his rifle across his knees. He faced the darkness, away from them. He did not try to talk. He did not ask her name or her sister's names. He just sat, a silent guardian, leaving them to their grief. Isabel watched him. The firelight flickered across the hard planes of his face. She had spent the last 2 weeks in the company of monsters. Men who laughed, who drank, who pawed at them, who spoke of all the terrible things they were going to do. Their cruelty was loud and predictable. This man was silent. His violence was swift and absolute, as cold and impersonal as the mountains around them. He had killed a man without blinking, and then he had dug graves with the patience of a farmer. Now he gave them his food, his blankets, and his back, offering them a privacy they had not known in weeks. This quiet, stoic kindness was more unsettling than any threat. It made no sense. It was a language she did not understand. She waited for the leverage to appear, for the debt to be called in. Men did not do things for free. She knew that. She had learned it from her uncle, from the men at the way station, from the outlaws. She watched him, her eyes burning with exhaustion. She would not sleep. She would watch him until morning, and she would be ready when he finally showed his true face. Seth knew she was watching him. He could feel her gaze on his back. He did not turn. He let her watch. He let her hold her fear and her suspicion. Trust was not something he could ask for, and he was not a man who asked for much. He had offered shelter. They had accepted. The rest was just weather and time. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind in the high branches, and waited for the dawn. The second day of travel was a blur of aching muscles and biting cold. Seth set a relentless pace, pulling them higher into the granite teeth of the mountains. He did not speak, and the silence stretched, broken only by the wind, the horses' labored breaths, and Clara's occasional, vacant humming. Isabel walked beside the buckskin, her hand locked on the saddle, her gaze fixed on the endless, rising wall of pine and rock. She had not slept, and her body felt like a raw nerve, but she would not show weakness. She would not fall. They crested a high ridge just as the light began to fail. Seth stopped. Below them, tucked into a narrow valley carved by a swift-moving creek, was his homestead. It was not a farm. It was a fortress. The cabin was small, built of thick, dark timber, its back set almost against a sheer cliff face. A low stone chimney puffed a thin line of smoke, meaning he must have left a fire banked. A small, sturdy corral stood empty, and a lean-to workshop was attached to the cabin's side. The valley was a dead end, surrounded on 3 sides by towering, impassable peaks. There was only one way in or out, the trail they had just taken. It was the most isolated place Isabel had ever seen. It was, she realized with a jolt, completely defensible. "This is it," he said. He led the horse down the steep path. When they reached the cabin, he slid the heavy bar on the door and pushed it open. The single room was dark, warm, and smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot filled the center. Against the back wall, there was a larger rope bed, clearly his own. He gestured to the main room. "This is yours. Take the bed. I'll sleep in the shop." He did not wait for an answer. He began moving his own things, a bedroll, a box of ammunition, a few traps into the lean-to without ceremony. Isabel watched him, her suspicion warring with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He was giving them his bed, his cabin. "We can take the floor," she said, her voice stiff. "That bed is bigger. You 3 stay together," he replied, not looking at her. "There's stew left in the pot. Eat." He took his rifle and went back outside, leaving them alone in the dim, warm space. For the first time in weeks, there was a solid door and a bar between them and the world. Rose went immediately to the rope bed and collapsed, asleep before Isabel could even pull the blanket over her. Clara sat on the cot, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall. Isabel ladled the stew, a thick, dark broth with chunks of rabbit, into 3 bowls. She had to guide Clara's hand, forcing her to eat. Clara chewed and swallowed without expression. Isabel ate hers standing by the door, watching the snow begin to fall outside, watching the dark shape of Seth checking the perimeter of the valley. They slept for almost a full day. When Isabel finally awoke, her body screaming in protest, the cabin was quiet. Rose was still breathing deeply beside her, and Clara was on the cot, her eyes open, just staring. The fire was built up, and a fresh stack of wood sat beside it. Seth was gone. A few days established the new, strange rhythm of their lives. Winter arrived in earnest, burying the valley in a deep, muffling blanket of white. Seth was a ghost. He would rise before dawn, his movements in the attached lean-to barely audible, and be gone for hours, checking trap lines or hunting. He never entered the main cabin without knocking, and only then to drop off firewood or fresh game, which he left by the door. The sisters, slowly, began to thaw. The color returned to Rose's cheeks. After a week of sleep and steady food, she rediscovered her youth. She explored the cabin, then the small area around it, and eventually found the abandoned garden box Seth had built and then ignored. It was frozen solid, but she took to sitting by it, clearing the snow off, as if willing something to grow. Clara remained distant, but the constant, violent tremor had subsided. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if her body were a fragile thing she was not quite sure how to inhabit. She began to clean. She swept the floor, scrubbed the table, and washed their few clothes in a bucket of snowmelt, her movements robotic and repetitive. It was the only thing that seemed to calm her. Isabel took charge of the cabin's heart, the fire and the food. She needed to be busy. She could not stand the silence, could not stand the feeling of being indebted. She baked bread from his flour, stretching the rations. She learned to skin the rabbits and squirrels he left, her stomach rolling at first, then hardening with resolve. She boiled and stitched their torn dresses. She took over the woodpile, splitting the round Seth hauled, the physical labor a release for the terror and rage coiling inside her. All the while, she watched him. She watched him from the cabin window, her mistrust a physical ache. He was, she had to admit, meticulously respectful. He never spoke to Clara unless Clara spoke first, which she never did. He never commented on their appearance, even though their hair was lank and their dresses were thin. He never, ever expected thanks. He would leave a brace of rabbits on the porch and walk away, never waiting for her to open the door and acknowledge the offering. This absolute lack of expectation unnerved her. Cruelty. She understood. Greed. She expected. But this quiet, dutiful provision felt like a trap she could not see. He was feeding them, housing them, protecting them. He would, at some point, demand payment. The waiting was its own kind of torture. One night, the wind woke her. A fierce, high-altitude storm had slammed into the valley, rattling the windows and screaming down the chimney. The world was a roaring, white chaos. Then she heard it, a steady drip, drip, drip. A leak had sprung in the roof, right over their bed. The blankets were getting wet. Rose was still asleep, but Clara was sitting up, her eyes wide. "It's leaking," Isabel whispered. The door to the lean-to opened. Seth stood there, silhouetted against the fire he was already building up in the main hearth. "The roof's gone loose," he said over the howl of the wind. "You'll have to sleep by the fire. Bring your bedding." They dragged the mattresses and blankets to the hearth, clustering in the small circle of warmth. Seth took the cot, placing it furthest from them, near the door, his rifle beside him. They lay there, the four of them, trapped in the small cabin, the storm raging outside like a living thing. Isabel could not sleep. She lay on her back, staring into the flickering shadows on the ceiling, listening to the wind and the soft breathing of her sisters. She must have drifted off, because suddenly she was not in the cabin. She was back in the wagon, the air thick with the smell of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies. A heavy hand was on her arm, another covering her mouth, the laughter scraping her ears. She woke with a choked gasp, sitting bolt upright. Her heart was a trapped bird, beating against her ribs. The cabin was dark, the fire low. "You're all right." His voice came from the shadows. She snapped her head toward the cot. Seth was not on it. He was sitting on the floor near the hearth, awake, his rifle across his lap. He had been on watch. "It was just a dream," she whispered, her voice shaking. She was humiliated, furious at her own weakness. He did not ask what it was. He did not pry or offer false comfort. He simply nodded, as if a nightmare were the most normal thing in the world. He reached for a spare blanket folded on his pack. "You're cold," he said. He didn't move toward her. He just held it out. She stared at it, then at him. His face was unreadable in the dim light. She shuffled forward on her knees and took the blanket, her fingers brushing his. His hand was steady and warm. She wrapped the thick wool around her shoulders and returned to her mattress, her back to him. She did not sleep, but the panic slowly receded, replaced by a profound, aching confusion. She began to notice other things, small things. A few days later, she was handing him a cup of hot water. The morning was bitter, and he was working in the lean-to, mending a harness. As he reached to take the tin cup, she saw it, a fine, almost invisible tremor in his right hand. His fingers, which she had seen swing an axe with brutal precision, were not perfectly steady. He closed his hand around the cup, and it was gone. But she had seen it. She started paying closer attention. She saw the way his eyes would sometimes go distant, fixing on the far wall, his jaw tight. She noticed he never, ever talked about his past. If she asked where he was from, he would say East. If she asked about family, he would change the subject to the weather or the state of the woodpile. He, too, was carrying something. He had his own ghosts, his own nightmares. He was just quieter about them. The isolation, the silence, and the encroaching cold began to work on Clara. She had started to speak again, but only in short, whispered sentences to Rose. She still avoided Isabel's gaze, as if ashamed. One evening, Rose was asleep. The cabin was quiet, the wind a low moan outside. Isabel was brushing Clara's long, dark hair by the fire, the simple, familiar motion a comfort to them both. "Your hair's getting so long," Isabel murmured. "It's beautiful, like Mama's." Clara was silent for a long time. Isabel thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice so low, Isabel had to lean in to hear. Clara spoke. He liked my hair." Isabel's hand froze. "Who, sweetheart?" "Pa," Clara whispered. "He always said it was my best feature." She paused, and her thin shoulders began to shake. "The men, the first ones, the ones who took the farm, before the Outlaws." Isabel felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She remembered that day. A different band of men, supposedly deputies working for the bank, had come to seize the farm. Their pa had argued. There had been a gunshot. The men had told the girls to pack one bag and leave. Isabel had been so blinded by grief and panic, trying to get Rose, trying to get them away. "What, Clara?" Isabel whispered, her throat tight. "What did they do?" "One of them." Clara's voice was flat, dead. All the emotion scoured from it. "He grabbed me. He pulled me into the barn. He said pretty hair shouldn't go to waste. He... She couldn't say the word. She just broke. A dry, racking sob tore through her. A sound of old, buried pain. Isabel dropped the brush. "Oh, God, Clara!" She pulled her sister back, holding her, but Clara was stiff, unyielding. Isabel felt a wave of sickness and guilt so strong it made her dizzy. She had been there. She had been outside, arguing with the other man, and she had not known. She had not protected her. "I should have stopped it," Isabel whispered, tears of rage and shame burning her eyes. "I should have known. It's my fault." In the lean-to, Seth was sharpening his skinning knife on a whetstone. The door to the main cabin was cracked open an inch for warmth. He heard every word, the rhythmic shing, shing, of the stone against steel stopped. He sat in the cold, dark workshop, his hand gripping the knife, his face like carved granite. He listened to Clara's broken sobs and Isabel's whispered self-recrimination until the sounds finally faded into a raw, exhausted silence. The next morning, he was gone. Isabel woke to the cold. The fire was dying. The cabin felt empty. She jumped from the bed. She looked into the lean-to. His bedroll was gone. His saddle was gone. She ran to the corral. The buckskin was gone. A pure, cold panic seized her. He had left them, just like their uncle, just like everyone. He had heard Clara's story, heard that she was damaged, spoiled, and he had abandoned them. He had left them to die in the snow, in a valley they couldn't even find their way out of. "He's gone," she whispered, her breath pluming. She ran back inside, her hatred for him a living thing, burning away her fear. "He's gone," she said to Clara, who was just waking. "He left us!" For 2 days, they were alone. Isabel became a fury. She barred the door. She found the spare rifle he had left in the lean-to and propped it by the window. She rationed the food, her jaw set. She would not let them die. They would survive this. They would survive him. Rose cried. Clara retreated back into her shell, sitting on the cot, her hands shaking again. Isabel just fed the fire, her eyes on the pass, her heart a cold, heavy stone. On the evening of the second day, she heard it, the crunch of hooves in the snow. She grabbed the rifle, her hands steady. She peered through the window. It was him. The buckskin was plodding, head low, laden with heavy sacks. Seth was walking beside it, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. He didn't look at the cabin. He just walked to the corral, unsaddled the horse, and rubbed it down with a handful of straw. Then, one by one, he hauled the heavy sacks to the porch. He set them down, turned, and walked into the lean-to, closing the door behind him. He never looked at the window. He never checked to see if they were alive. Isabel stared at the sacks. She waited. 10 minutes, 20. He did not come out. Finally, her curiosity overriding her anger. She unbarred the door and opened it a crack. The cold air rushed in. The sacks were just sitting there. She dragged one inside, her muscles straining. Then the other. She untied the knot on the first one. Flour. A huge 50-pound sack. The second held beans, salt, coffee, and bacon. She opened the third sack. Her hands stopped. Inside were 3 heavy wool coats, second-hand but clean and thick. Underneath them were 3 pairs of sturdy leather boots, all small sizes. And at the bottom, dried apples, sugar, and 2 bars of lye soap. He hadn't abandoned them. He had heard Clara's story, heard their desperation, and he had ridden for 2 days in a blizzard to the nearest town. He had traded or bought the things they would need to survive the winter. He had come back. Later that night, the guilt and confusion were a storm inside her. She saw him outside, chopping wood. The moon was a thin, frozen sliver, and the rhythmic thunk of his axe was the only sound in the frozen world. He was splitting logs with a fierce, steady energy, as if he were fighting the wood. She pulled on one of the new coats. It was heavy and warm, smelling faintly of wool and smoke. She put on the boots. She stepped outside. The cold hit her face like a slap. He stopped, the axe held low. He was breathing hard. She stood 20 feet away, her arms wrapped around her new coat. "Thank you," she said. The words came out choked and small. He just looked at her, his face shadowed, his breath pluming. "For the coats," she managed, feeling foolish. "And the food." He nodded once, a short, sharp movement. "Winter's here," he said, his voice rough. "You needed them." He turned back to the wood, as if she were dismissed. The gesture, his disinterest, stung her more than an insult. "Why did you do it?" she blurted out, the words louder than she intended. "Why not just leave us? We're nothing to you." He stopped again. He didn't look at her. He looked past her, at the dark, frozen pines on the ridge. "You don't owe me anything," he said. He raised the axe high above his head and brought it down. splitting the log in two with a single, clean crack. Isabel stood there for another moment, her hands shaking, and then she turned and fled back into the cabin, his words echoing in her head. She started to watch him, not as a jailer or a threat, but as a man. She saw him through the window one frigid morning, hauling buckets of water from the creek, his shirt pulled tight against his back, and she could see the powerful muscles working underneath. She saw him skin a deer with a swift, economical precision that was both brutal and graceful. One afternoon, he was washing by the creek, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. He thought he was alone. He stripped his shirt off, and Isabel, glancing out the window, froze. His back was a road map of old, white scars, long, pale lines, thick and raised, crisscrossed his skin from shoulder to waist. They were not from battle. They were the deliberate, patterned scars of a whip. She drew back from the window, her hand clamped over her mouth, a cold sickness rising in her. A week passed. The cabin was warm. They were fed. They were safe. The rhythm of survival became a routine. One night, a deep cold had settled over the valley, the kind that made the trees crack and the stars seem painfully bright. Rose and Clara were asleep, bundled in their blankets. Isabel was mending one of Clara's dresses by the fire. She could hear Seth in the lean-to, the soft click and scrape of him mending a trap. The coffee pot was still warm on the hearth. Her hand was shaking. She was terrified. Not of him, not anymore. She was terrified of this feeling, this impossible, complicated gratitude. She was terrified of the silence between them. She stood up. She poured a tin cup full of the hot, black coffee. She walked to the lean-to door and, before she could lose her nerve, she pushed it open. He looked up from his work. The small room was cold, lit by a single lantern. His fingers were wrapped in strips of leather, his face intent. "I brought you coffee," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He stared at the cup as if it were a puzzle. Then his gaze lifted to her face. He slowly, deliberately, wiped his hands on a rag and stood up. He took the cup from her. Their fingers brushed. His were calloused and cold. She didn't leave. She just stood in the doorway, one foot in the warm cabin, one in his cold world. The silence stretched. He took a sip of the coffee, his eyes never leaving hers over the rim of the cup. He was the one who broke the silence. His voice was low, gentle, and it went through her like a jolt. "You're safe here." It was not an opinion. It was a promise. It was the first thing he had ever offered her that wasn't food or shelter. Isabel's whole body trembled, a tremor that started in her knees and worked its way up. She couldn't speak. She just nodded. Once, a small, jerky motion. She turned and retreated back into the warmth of the cabin, barring the door behind her, the feeling of his gaze burning into her back. The first real snow came not as a gentle dusting, but as a silent, heavy assault. It began in the night, and by morning, the valley was unrecognizable, buried under a foot of white, the pines drooping, the creek choked to a dark, sluggish ribbon. The world had shrunk to the walls of the cabin and the impenetrable wall of falling snow. It was on the third day of the storm, as the snow finally tapered off, that Isabel saw him, a figure, dark against the endless white, moving slowly up the pass. Her heart seized. She grabbed the spare rifle from the wall, her hands instantly steady. "Clara, get Rose into the lean-to. Bar the door from inside. Do not come out." Clara, her face pale, did as she was told, pulling a sleepy Rose with her. The heavy thud of the bar falling into place echoed in the cabin. Isabel stood by the window, the rifle stock cold against her cheek. She watched the figure approach. It was not Jeb Stokes. The man was older, shorter, and leading a mule. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and raised a hand, empty, in greeting. She heard Seth's door open in the lean-to. He stepped out, his own rifle in hand, but held low. "That's enough. Silas," Seth called out. The man, Silas, grinned, his face a map of wrinkles under a thick beaver hat. "Just checking if you'd been snowed in for good. McAllister." "I'm here," Seth said. He glanced back at the cabin, his voice holding a warning. It's all right. Isabel. He's a friend. She opened the door, her eyes narrow, the rifle still in her grip. She did not trust this. A friend. A connection to the outside world. Silas looked past Seth and saw her. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He looked at the two smaller sets of boot prints in the snow by the door. He looked at Seth. His eyebrows raised. "Been busy," Silas said. His voice a low gravel. "Come inside," Seth said, ignoring the comment. "Get warm." The trapper stomped the snow from his boots and entered the cabin, bringing with him the sharp, wild smell of pine, cured pelts, and wood smoke. He nodded to Isabel. "Ma'am?" He accepted a cup of coffee from Seth, warming his raw, chapped hands around the tin. "Came down from the high country. Winters come early, traps are lean. Heading to Cheyenne to trade what I got. You seen anyone on the trail?" Seth asked, his voice casual, but his eyes intent. Silas's expression sobered. He took a long, loud sip. "That's why I came. I was in Laramie 2 weeks back, heard talk." Isabel, who had been standing by the fire, felt a cold dread return. "What talk?" Seth asked. "About those bushwhackers you cleared out down on the Laramie Fork. The Stokes brothers." Seth did not move. "Seems you didn't get all of them." Silas said, "There was a fourth, Jebediah Stokes, the eldest. He wasn't with them that day. He came back looking for 'em. Found the graves." Silas stared into his cup. "Heard he was in town, drinking, asking questions. He's looking for the 3 girls. Says he's gonna get back what's his—" The cabin was silent. The only sound was the fire hissing. Isabel felt the blood drain from her face, the safety she had just begun to feel, the warmth of the cabin, the solidness of the walls. It all dissolved. The wilderness was not the danger. A man was— "He ride with a posse?" Seth asked. "No," Silas said. "He's alone, and he's a tracker. Seth, a good one. Worse than that, he's patient." Seth nodded, his face carved from ice. "I'm obliged. Silas, just be watchful," the trapper said. He finished his coffee and stood, pulling his thick coat tight. "This high valley, it's a good place to hide, but nothing stays hidden forever." He left. The snow swallowed him and his mule within minutes. The silence he left behind was terrifying. Seth did not speak for a long time. He stood at the window, staring out at the white, empty pass. Then he turned, his movements economical and precise. "Clara," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through her fog. She and Rose had emerged from the lean-to, their faces frightened. "Come here." He unrolled a worn, yellowed map on the table. "This is the valley. This is the creek. This is the pass. You're smart. You're quiet. I want you to learn this. If you have to run, you follow this creek south until you reach a split granite boulder. It looks like a broken tooth. From there, you go due west. There's an old hunter's blind 2 miles in. You wait there." Clara stared at the map. Her hand, trembling slightly, reached out and traced the ink line of the creek. She nodded. "Isabel," he said. He took the spare rifle from her, checked its action, and pulled a small box of cartridges from his stores. Outside, she followed him into the glaring, cold afternoon. The air was sharp and thin. "Do you know how to shoot?" he asked. "I've shot a squirrel rifle," she said, her voice defensive. "Not a repeater. It's the same," he said. "Just heavier, more kick." He pointed to a dark knot on a dead pine, maybe 30 yards away. "Aim for that." He showed her how to work the lever, how to load the chamber, how to settle the butt plate against her shoulder. His hands were quick and impersonal. He stepped back. "Fire!" She raised the rifle. It was heavy, the metal biting cold. Her arms trembled. She lined up the sights, held her breath, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The kick slammed into her shoulder, a brutal, violent punch that knocked her off balance. The shot went wide, splintering bark a foot above the knot. "You flinched," he said, his voice flat. "You're fighting it. Don't fight it. Let it come. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Again. She levered another round. Her shoulder throbbed. She was angry. Angry at the gun, at the cold, at the man hunting them. Most of all, she was angry at Seth. He was standing there, his arms crossed, his face impassive, watching her fail. She hated this feeling of weakness, this reliance on him. "I can't," she said, lowering the rifle. "It's too heavy." "Yes, you can," he said. "This isn't a request. You need to do this. Your sisters need you to do this." His words hit her like a slap. She raised the rifle, her jaw set. She breathed out, just as he had shown her, and squeezed. The shot was closer. Again. They stayed out there for an hour, until the box of cartridges was half empty and her shoulder was a raw, purple bruise. She was hitting the knot. Not every time, but enough. Her hands were numb. Her face was stiff with cold, but a hot, fierce pride was burning in her chest. He nodded. "That's enough. Clean it every night. Keep it loaded." As they walked back to the cabin, she wrestled with her own boiling emotions. She was grateful for the lesson, and she hated him for it. She hated that he was right. She hated that she felt safer knowing he was there, and she hated that she was not strong enough. Not on her own. He seemed to sense her inner turmoil, the silent, furious battle she was waging against her own dependence. But he did not push. He did not offer soft words. He just let her be angry. He let her fight him in her head, letting her keep what little pride she had left. He just built up the defenses, stacking firewood high against the cabin's north wall as a windbreak, and spending a day clearing brush from the mouth of the valley, giving them a clear line of sight. The shared danger, the isolation, and the long, dark nights began to change the atmosphere in the cabin. After Rose and Clara were asleep, the two of them would be left awake by the fire. The silence heavy. Isabel would mend clothes, her fingers working the needle. Seth would be oiling his traps or sharpening his knife, the rhythmic shing of the whetstone a hypnotic sound. One night, the wind howling. Isabel spoke into the quiet. "Why do you stay here?" He did not look up from the trap he was mending. "It's quiet, far from towns." "You're not a man who's afraid of towns," she said, bolder than she felt. "I saw you in the clearing. You're not afraid of anything." He finally stopped. He looked at the fire. "I'm not afraid of towns. No, I just don't. I'm not good for 'em." She waited. He seemed to be weighing his words. "I used to want a home," she whispered, her own confession spilling out before she could stop it. "Back, before, I used to imagine it. A small farm, like the one we had, a garden. I wanted a family." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "It's a foolish thing for a woman to want, I suppose." "It's not foolish," he said, his voice low. "It is now," she said, her voice hardening. "After what's happened, after what I am, what we are, no decent man, no one." She let the words trail off. Ashamed. She felt broken. Used goods. She was 24 years old and her life was over. Seth was silent for a full minute. She thought he would not reply. "I wasn't always a homesteader," he said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "I came here to get away." "From what?" He looked at her then, his eyes dark, reflecting the firelight. "I used to hunt men, for bounty." She froze, the needle stopping in her hand. A bounty hunter. It made a terrible, perfect sense. The speed of his draw, the coldness, the way he had buried those men without a prayer. "I was good at it," he said, his voice flat, devoid of pride. "I was fast, and I was a good tracker, and I didn't ask questions." He looked down at his hands, the ones she had seen tremble. 5 years ago, down in Kansas, there was a bounty on a man who'd killed a family, burned their farm, $500. He paused, and she saw his jaw tighten. "I tracked him for a week, found him in a line shack, hiding out. He was just a boy, maybe 20. He raised his gun. I shot him." He stared into the fire, his mind miles and years away. He was innocent, the man who did it. He was his cousin. Stole his horse. His name? I found out later in town, after I brought him in. He shook his head, a small, pained movement. "I didn't wait. I didn't ask. I just saw the money. I saw the job." He looked at her, and his gaze was raw. "I buried him. I gave the money to a church, and I rode north. I didn't stop until I found this valley. Some men, Isabel, we've done things. We're better off left alone." She stared at him, her heart aching. He had just laid his soul bare. He had met her shame and raised her his guilt. He saw himself as a killer, a man who had forfeited his right to be around people. He had looked at her, broken and soiled, and seen an equal. The air in the cabin was now charged. The space between them, once measured in feet, was now a thin, electric wire. The glances were no longer just suspicious or curious. They were knowing. When he passed her a log for the fire, his fingers brushed hers, and she felt it like a brand. When she looked up, she would find him watching her, his face intent, before he quickly looked away. She felt a pull toward him that terrified her. It was a dark, sharp, physical wanting. It was a betrayal of her fear, of her sisters, of her past. But it was there. She was ashamed of it, but she could not deny it. She felt guilty for wanting his touch, and he felt guilty for wanting to give it. One night, the nightmare returned, worse than ever. It was not the vague dream of before. This was Jeb Stokes. His face, which she had never seen, was a composite of the Outlaws, of her uncle, of every man who had ever looked at her with greed. He was in the cabin, his hands reaching for Rose, his laughter filling the small room. She woke up with a silent scream, her body rigid, her skin soaked in cold sweat. She couldn't breathe. The cabin felt like a coffin. She slipped from the bed, grabbing one of the new wool coats. She fumbled with the bar, her hands shaking so badly she could barely lift it, and stumbled out into the freezing night. The moon was full, casting a stark blue light over the snow. The cold was a shock, but it was clean. She gasped for air, leaning against the cabin wall, her heart pounding. He was there. He was not in the lean-to. He was sitting on a stump near the woodpile, his rifle across his knees. He had been on watch, unable to sleep. He saw her and stood, his dark form a shadow against the snow. The sight of him, the knowledge that he was awake, that he was there, broke the last of her control. She slid down the wall and crumpled into the snow, burying her face in her hands. The sobs she had held back for weeks tore out of her. It was a sound of utter despair, of a creature that had been strong for too long and had nothing left. He was in front of her in 2 strides. He did not speak. He did not ask what was wrong. He reached down, put one arm under her knees and the other around her back, and lifted her as if she weighed nothing. He carried her to the lean-to, away from the cabin, away from her sleeping sisters. He sat on his own narrow cot, pulling her onto his lap, cradling her against his chest like a child. He was so warm. His body was solid, a wall of strength. He held her, his hand on the back of her head, his fingers tangled in her hair, and he just let her cry. She wept into the rough wool of his shirt, all the terror, all the grief, all the shame, pouring out of her. He just held her, his chin resting on the top of her head, rocking her gently. When the sobs finally quieted, she was exhausted, empty. She was still trembling, but the panic was gone, replaced by the simple, undeniable fact of his arms around her. She was pressed against him, his heartbeat a steady, slow drum under her ear. She was alive. She was warm. She tilted her head back. His face was inches from hers, shadowed and stark. His eyes were full of a pain that matched her own. She was so cold, and he was so warm. She was so tired of being afraid. Before she knew what she was doing, she reached up, her trembling hand cupping his rough, unshaven jaw. She pulled his face down to hers and kissed him. It was a clumsy, desperate kiss. It was the taste of salt from her tears in the cold night air. It was a plea. For 1 second, he was still shocked. Then, his own control broke. His arm tightened around her waist, crushing her against him, and he kissed her back. It was not gentle. It was a raw, hungry, desperate kiss of two people who had been starving for something they could not name. Then, just as quickly, he tore his mouth from hers. He gripped her shoulders, his fingers biting into her flesh, and gently but firmly pushed her back, putting a space between their bodies. She stared at him, confused, humiliated, rejection. It was a cold, sharp pain. "No," he whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. He was breathing hard, his eyes shut tight. She started, the shame flooding her. "Not like this," he said, his voice ragged. He opened his eyes, and they were full of agony. "Not when you're hurting, not when you're scared." She just stared at him, her mind unable to comprehend. Men took. They took what they wanted, especially when a woman was weak. "I won't," he said, his voice dropping. "I won't be another man who takes something from you, not when you're not whole." She understood. It was not rejection. It was the opposite. He was protecting her, not from the world, but from himself, from a choice made in fear and desperation. He was giving her back a dignity she thought she had lost forever. A new wave of tears, different this time, welled in her eyes. She was confused and moved and overwhelmed. He sat there, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on his knees, as if fighting a physical battle with himself. "Go inside, Isabel," he said gently, his voice still rough. "Go back to bed. You're safe." She slid off his lap, her legs unsteady. She walked, like a dreamer, back to the cabin. She barred the door, the heavy thud loud in the silence. She crawled back into the bed, next to the warm, oblivious bodies of her sisters. She lay in the dark, her body thrumming, her mind racing. She replayed the moment, the power in his arms, the desperation in his kiss, and the absolute iron strength of his refusal. She was ashamed of her own weakness, her own raw, physical need. How could she feel this? How could she want a man, after what men had done? But as she lay there, the shame was slowly burned away by something else, a hot, slow-moving ache deep in her belly. It was not fear. It was not gratitude. It was desire, pure, sharp, and undeniable. She wanted him, not just the protector. She wanted the man with the scarred back and the haunted eyes, the man who, when given the perfect chance to take, had chosen to give. She lay in the dark, her hands shaking, and for the first time in her life, she ached for a man's touch. The morning after the kiss was a quiet agony of awkwardness. Isabel avoided his eyes, her shame a hot, heavy blanket. She busied herself at the hearth, her movements jerky. But Seth acted as if nothing had happened. He did not leer. He did not smirk. He did not demand. He simply took the cup of coffee she offered without looking up. His voice the same low gravel as he said, "Snow's deep. I'll need to clear the corral." That simple, steady normalcy was more disarming than any apology. He had given her a gift, the gift of his refusal, and he was not going to make her pay for it with shame. A new rhythm settled over the valley, born of shared work and the looming threat of Jeb Stokes. The homestead, once just Seth's refuge, became a shared fortress. The routines of survival, once a chore, became a quiet act of defiance. Clara, finding a stub of charcoal and some old, yellowed freight receipts in Seth's stores, began to draw. She would sit by the window for hours, her eyes fixed on the jays and squirrels at the edge of the clearing, her fingers moving with a slow, hesitant grace. She sketched the trees, the shape of the cliffs, the way the snowdrifts formed. It was a way for her to look at the world without having to speak to it. Rose, restless and full of a child's energy, became Seth's shadow. He, in his quiet way, took her under his wing. He set small snares with her, teaching her how to read the tracks of rabbits and weasels. He taught her how to handle a small skinning knife, how to be patient, how to be quiet. She took to it with a fierce pride. And one afternoon, she returned to the cabin alone, her face flushed with triumph, holding up 2 rabbits for Isabel to see, and Isabel baked, with the new sack of flour. She felt a piece of her old self return, the simple, physical act of kneading dough, of coaxing life and warmth from flour and water, was a comfort. The smell of fresh bread baking in the small Dutch oven filled the cabin, a scent of home, of normalcy, that was so potent it almost made her weep. She and Seth fell into a domestic pattern that was unspoken, but as solid as the timber walls. She would rise first, using the kindling he had split the night before to start the fire. He would rise in the dark, his movements in the lean-to a familiar, muffled sound, and go out to check the perimeter, his rifle in hand. He would return with the cold clinging to him, and she would have coffee hot and waiting. They worked side by side. When he repaired the leaking roof, she was the one on the ground, handing him the shingles and the hammer. When she split the daily wood, he would sharpen the axe for her beforehand. They moved around each other in the small cabin, a silent, practiced dance. They passed the salt, the ladle, the ammunition box, without words, just a shared understanding. This growing comfort, this shared space, only made the tension that had sparked in the lean-to thrum louder. It was in the long, quiet evenings. It was in the way his eyes would linger on her when he thought she wasn't looking. It was in the jolt she felt when his hand brushed hers as he took a biscuit. It was a hunger, sharp and deep, that she was terrified to name and ashamed to feel. But it was there. Then the world vanished. A blizzard, fiercer than any they had yet seen, slammed into the valley. It was not a storm. It was a siege. For 4 days, the wind howled, a high, thin scream that never stopped. The snow did not fall. It moved sideways, a solid driving wall of white that erased the sky. The mountains, the trees, they were trapped, the 4 of them, in the one small room. Seth had moved his cot from the lean-to, which was now filling with snowdrifts, and placed it near the door. The cabin was a small, warm pocket in a world of roaring, frozen chaos. On the 3rd night, the storm was at its peak. The wind sounded like a freight train trying to tear the roof from the cabin. No one could sleep. Rose was bundled between Isabel and Clara on the big bed, her eyes wide. Clara was humming, her high, tuneless sound a counterpoint to the wind's shriek. Seth sat on his cot, methodically cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that day, his movements a way to occupy his hands, his mind. Isabel sat by the hearth, feeding sticks into the fire. The cabin was lit only by the flickering, orange light. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of wood smoke and the tension of 4 people trapped too close. "It's loud," Rose whispered, her voice small. "It's just wind, sweetheart. It can't get in," Isabel said, trying to sound calmer than she felt. "It sounds angry," Clara whispered, her eyes on the rattling window. Seth stopped his work. He looked at Clara. "It's just air," he said, his voice a low rumble under the storm. "It's big, but it's empty. It can't think. It can't hurt you. We're warm. We're safe." Clara seemed to consider this. She looked at him, truly looked at him. For the first time, she nodded. Once, and her humming softened. Isabel watched him. He had spoken to Clara with such simple, direct honesty. He had not dismissed her fear, but had given her a solid thing to hold on to. He was a good man. The thought was so clear and sharp, it hurt. Later, the girls finally slept, exhausted by the storm's assault. The cabin was quiet, save for the wind. Seth had put his rifle aside and was staring into the fire, his face grim, lost in his own thoughts. Isabel looked at him, his profile, lit by the flames, the hard line of his jaw, the deep weariness around his eyes, the scars she knew were hidden under his shirt, the hands that could kill, that had trembled, that had refused to take, the ache in her chest, the one she had been fighting, the one she had been so ashamed of, swelled into something unbearable. It was not just desire, it was a need to connect, a need to feel something other than cold, and fear, and shame. She stood up from the hearth. Her body moved before her mind could stop it. She crossed the small space between them. He looked up, his eyes widening slightly as she stood before him. She did not speak. She did not need to. She knelt on the floor in front of his cot. She reached out, her hand shaking, and placed it on his knee. His muscles tensed under her touch. She leaned in, slowly, giving him every chance to stop her, to turn her away again. She watched his eyes. They were dark, full of 1,000 questions, and a deep, mirrored hunger. This time, when she kissed him, he did not pull away. His hand came up, his rough, calloused fingers sinking into her hair, and he kissed her back. It was not the desperate, fumbling kiss of the lean-to. This was slow. It was deep. It was a question and an answer. It was the taste of coffee and wood smoke and a profound, shared loneliness. He broke the kiss, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was ragged. "Isabel," he whispered, her name a prayer and a warning. "I know," she whispered back. She did not wait for him to choose. This had to be her choice. She had to be the one to act, to prove to herself that she was not just a thing to be acted upon. Her trembling fingers went to the buttons of her worn dress. He watched her, his hand still tangled in her hair, his body rigid. I want this," she whispered, her voice cracking. She fumbled with the buttons, her hands clumsy. I need to feel something. Something other than that, other than the pain." She pulled the dress from her shoulders, letting it fall. She was in her thin chemise, her skin glowing in the firelight. She saw his gaze drop, his breath catch. She was thin, gaunt from weeks of near starvation, but she did not feel shame. She felt powerful. She reached for the buttons on his shirt. His hand covered hers, stopping her. His was shaking. "Are you sure?" he rasped. "You don't have to. This ain't part of the bargain. There is no bargain." "I know," she said, her voice stronger. "This isn't for you, Seth. This is for me." His hand fell away. She unbuttoned his shirt, pushing it open. The firelight flickered over the hard muscles of his chest and the faint, pale lines of the scars that snaked up from his waist. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to one of the scars. A low groan tore from his throat. He pulled her up, off the floor, and onto the narrow cot with him, his mouth finding hers again. It was desperate now, and fumbling, and full of a longing so deep it was an agony. It was the frantic clash of two people who had been alone for too long. Their union was not gentle. Not at first. It was a desperate, seeking, almost violent need to be close, to erase the space between them. But as the first frantic moments passed, it softened. He moved with a tenderness that undid her. He held her face between his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, his eyes locked on hers. She cried. Silent tears streamed down her face, tears of release, of grief, of a terrible, aching relief. It was not pain, it was just feeling. It was so much feeling, after so much numbness, that it overwhelmed her. He mistook the tears for pain. He froze, his face stricken with guilt. "I hurt you." "No," she sobbed, clutching him, digging her nails into his back. "No, don't stop, please." He held her, his movements slow, tender, until the last of her tension broke. He held her after, pulling the rough wool blanket over them both, his arms locked around her as if he would never let her go. He kissed her hair, her forehead, her tear-soaked cheeks. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice thick. "I've got you." She lay against his chest, listening to his heart slow, and for the first time since her father died, she felt deep in her bones, completely and utterly safe. The next morning was a new kind of awkward. The storm had broken, and the silence of the valley was absolute, muffled by the fresh, deep snow. When Isabel woke, she was tangled in the blanket on the cot, alone. Seth was already at the fire, his back to her, poking at the flames. She slipped from the cot, her body aching in ways that were new and strange. She grabbed her dress, her face burning. She had been so bold, so wanton. Now, in the cold, gray light of morning, she was mortified. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling, her back to him. She didn't know what she expected. A new possessiveness, a crude comment, Or, worse, a cold, shamed silence. "Coffee's hot," he said, his voice the same as always. She turned. He was looking at her, not with hunger, but with a quiet, steady warmth. He held out a tin cup. She took it, their fingers brushing. The jolt was still there, but it was different now. She busied herself with breakfast, her movements still stiff. Rose woke, yawning and rubbing her eyes. "Is the storm gone?" "It's gone," Seth said. "Snow's piled high. I'll have to shovel us out." Isabel was frying bacon, the smell filling the cabin. She was clumsy, her mind 1,000 miles away, and the hot grease splattered, hitting her wrist. She yelped, dropping the pan. "Clumsy!" she hissed at herself, furious, her eyes stinging. Seth was there in an instant. He took her wrist, turning it over in his hand, his touch gentle. "It's just a small burn." He looked at her, his eyes soft. "You're all right, Isabel." He paused, and the barest hint of a smile touched his lips. "You always make bacon sound like a gunfight." She stared at him. It was a tease, a gentle, quiet tease. He was not treating her like a ruined woman or a new possession. He was treating her like her. A small, shaky laugh escaped her. "It's a battle every time." The awkwardness broke, like a fever. He was the same Seth. He had not changed, but everything had. Rose was watching them. Her gaze was sharp, moving from Isabel to Seth, then back to the cot, which was a tangle of blankets. She saw the way Isabel's face flushed, the way Seth's eyes softened when he looked at her. Later, when they were alone for a moment, Rose grabbed her sister's arm. You slept on his cot," she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dawning understanding. Isabel's face hardened. She pulled her sister close. "You will not speak of this," she commanded, her voice a low, fierce whisper. "Not to Clara, not to anyone, ever. Do you understand me?" Rose, frightened by her intensity, just nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Isabel's anger faded, replaced by guilt. She hugged her. "It's all right, Rosie. It's complicated. But we are safe. He is a good man." "This is our home now." That night, after the girls were asleep, she found him in the lean-to, organizing his traps. The cold was bitter, but he seemed to prefer it. "Seth," she said, standing in the doorway. He looked up. "I'm scared," she confessed, the words tumbling out. I'm scared of this, of needing you." She wrapped her arms around herself. "My whole life, I've just tried to stand on my own, to not need anyone, especially not a man." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "I'm terrified of becoming dependent on you, of being weak." He put down the trap and stood, wiping his hands on a rag. He crossed the small space and stood in front of her, so close she could feel the heat from his body. He did not touch her. He just looked at her, his gaze steady. "You're not mine because I saved you, Isabel," he said, his voice low and certain. "You're not mine at all. You're your own. You're the strongest woman I've ever met." He reached out, his hand hovering, before he gently cupped her chin. "You came to me last night. That wasn't weakness. That was strength." He took a deep breath. "You're free. That's why I want you." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, her heart aching with a relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. A week later, the pass was finally clear enough to travel. The sound of a horse brought them both outside, rifles in hand. It was Silas, the trapper. His face was grim. "Seth," he said, not dismounting. "You got trouble. Big trouble." "Jeb Stokes?" Seth asked, his body tensing. "Worse," Silas said. "Stokes got drunk in Cheyenne. He started talking about how you'd hold up here in the mountains. And he didn't just mention himself. He mentioned the 3 girls. Said you'd stolen them." Isabel felt her blood run cold. Silas spat into the snow. "The story's all twisted now. The good folk in town, the ones who ain't busy looking for a fight, They think you're some kind of monster. They think you kidnapped these women. They think you're holding them here against their will." "That's a lie," Isabel said, her voice shaking with rage. "It don't matter what's true, ma'am," Silas said, his eyes kind but his words hard. "It matters what they believe. The marshal, he's putting together a posse. They're coming here to rescue you." Seth was silent, his face a mask. He was doing the math. A posse. Not one man, but a dozen. Legal. "When?" Seth asked. 2 days, maybe 3. They'll wait for the pass to be safer. But they're coming. Seth. And they ain't coming to talk. Silas pulled a small sack from his mule. "Brought you some extra shot. It won't be enough." He looked at Seth. "You could run. Head north." Seth shook his head. "Run where? With 3 women, in this snow? We'd be dead in a week. And they'd just hunt us." "No." Silas nodded, as if he expected the answer. "Godspeed. McAllister." He turned his mule and rode away, a lone, dark figure against the snow. Seth went into the lean-to. Isabel followed him. He was pulling his saddle from the rack. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice tight with panic. "I'm riding out," he said, his movements efficient. He grabbed his bedroll and a sack of ammunition. "Riding out? Seth, they're coming here. You can't meet them on the trail. That's suicide." "I'm not going to fight them," he said. He turned to face her. "I'm riding to town." "To town? That's where they are. They'll hang you." "It's the only way," he said, his voice hard, but his eyes pained. "If I stay here, they'll come in force. There will be a fight. Bullets will fly. And you or your sisters, you'll be in the middle of it. I won't have that." He gripped her arms. "I'm going to ride in. I'm going to talk to the marshal. Alone. I'll tell him what happened. I'll clear your names. It's the only way to end this." "You can't," she cried, grabbing the front of his shirt. The terror of losing him was so strong, it eclipsed every other fear. "They won't listen. You said it yourself. They think you're a monster. They'll shoot you before you get 10 words out." "It's my story to tell. Isabel, my past. I'm the one they want. I have to be the one to face them." "No," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, trembling whisper. She looked up at him, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen. "You think I'll let you go? You think I'll just stand here and let you ride to your own hanging, now that I finally feel alive?" He stared at her, his resolve wavering in the face of her raw, protective fury. "You're not going alone," she said. He stared at her, her words hanging in the frozen air of the lean-to. "You think I'll let you go now that I finally feel alive? You're not coming. Isabel," he said, his voice flat. "Final." He turned back to his saddle, pulling the cinch tight. "You can't stop me," she said, her voice shaking with a new, unfamiliar rage. "I can shoot. I can ride. I am not one of your children to be left behind." He turned, his face hard. "That's exactly why you're staying. You're the one who can shoot. You're the one who can keep them safe if I'm wrong. If Stokes is closer than we think." He grabbed her shoulders, his grip tight, almost painful. "You think I'm riding to Cheyenne for my name? I'm doing this so that Posse doesn't ride here, so they don't come in with guns blazing, trying to rescue you. If they see you, they'll see a woman in a cabin with a man. They won't ask questions. Bullets will fly." She saw the raw fear in his eyes. It was not for himself. It was for her, for Clara, for Rose. "And what if they hang you?" she whispered, her fury collapsing into a cold dread. "What are we then? We'll be alone. They'll find us anyway." "They won't hang me," he said, his voice quiet, trying to convince himself as much as her. "The marshal, Davies, he's a hard man, but he's not stupid. I knew him years ago. He'll listen." He pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was not tender. It was hard and desperate and full of the metallic taste of fear. It was a brand, a promise, and a goodbye. He let her go. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me or Silas. Keep the rifle loaded. Keep your sisters away from the windows. If you hear anything, you get them into the lean-to and you bar it from the inside." She just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He led the buckskin out of the corral. He swung into the saddle, his movements economical, his face set. He did not look back. Isabel stood on the porch, the new wool coat clutched around her, and watched him ride down the pass. The silence of the valley swallowed him. He became a small, dark speck against the blinding white. And then he was gone. She felt as if he had taken the air from her lungs. She was losing him. She had just found him, and she was losing him. She turned, went inside, and dropped the heavy bar across the door. The sound was a hollow, final thud. Seth rode for 2 days, his mind a cold, flat plain. He did not stop to make a fire. He chewed jerky, let his horse drink from half-frozen creeks, and pushed on. He saw the tracks of the posse, a dozen riders, headed south. They were ahead of him, but they were moving slow, checking the trails. He cut west, using an old game trail he knew, and passed them in the night. He rode into Cheyenne in the gray light of the second morning. The town was a raw, muddy scar on the prairie, loud with the clang of anvils and the shouts of freight haulers. He was a pariah. Men stopped and stared as he rode down the main street. He was the ghost, the bounty hunter who had come back, the man who holed up in the mountains. He saw the whispers, the pointed fingers. He swung down from his horse in front of the marshal's office, his body aching with cold and fatigue. He pushed the door open. Marshal Davies was at his desk, a pot-bellied stove glowing red beside him. He was a man in his 50s, with a graying mustache and eyes that had seen too much. He looked up, and his hand, which had been on a stack of papers, moved slowly to rest on the butt of his pistol. "McAllister," he said, his voice flat. "I'd heard you were dead." "Not yet, Davies," Seth said. He stood in the middle of the room, his hands deliberately away from his gun. "I've got a posse out looking for you," the marshal said, his eyes narrow. "Save me some trouble and tell me where the girls are." "They're safe," Seth said. "They're at my place." "So it's true. You took 'em." "I rescued them," Seth said, his voice a low growl. "From the Stokes brothers, down on the Laramie Fork. I found them tied up, half-starved. Their wagon was overturned. I buried 4 men. Davies considered this. He knew Seth's reputation. It was violent, but it was not dishonest. "And Jeb Stokes? He's still out there. He's hunting them. That's why I've kept them hidden." The door to the office swung open, letting in a blast of cold air and the sound of a tinny piano. A woman stood there, wrapped in a gaudy fur coat, her face heavily powdered. It was Hattie, the woman who ran the Red Slipper Saloon and the rooms above it. "Well, well," she said, her voice a rough purr. She looked Seth up and down. "If it ain't the Mountain King himself, Marshal, you find his little princesses?" "Stay out of this, Hattie," Davies said, his voice tired. "I'll do no such thing," she snapped. "Jeb Stokes was in my place for a week, spending coin and talking loud. He said this one," she pointed a gloved finger at Seth, "stole his property. 3 girls said they were used-up goods from the trail. Damaged." She smiled, a cold, thin-lipped expression. "We all know what happens to girls like that, Marshal, and we all know what a man like McAllister, alone up there all these years, would want with them. He didn't rescue them. He just took them for himself, living like his wives. I'd wager." Seth's hand shot to his pistol, his body tensing, a killing rage in his eyes. "Seth, don't!" Davies shouted, his own gun out and leveled. Seth froze. His hand was on the grip, but he did not draw. He let his breath out, slow and ragged. He took his hand away. "She's lying," he said, his voice choked. "Am I?" Hattie laughed. "Tell him what really happened to him, McAllister. Tell him why they're so damaged no decent man would want him. Tell him what those outlaws did." Seth looked at her, his contempt a physical force. Then he looked at the marshal. Davies was watching him, his face hard, waiting. "Tell me, Seth," Davies said, "what happened to those girls?" Seth stood there, trapped, He could see it in their eyes. The prurient curiosity, the judgment. They wanted the ugly details. They wanted to hear the story of the girl's violation, to confirm that they were, in fact, used up. He thought of Clara, her dead eyes, her humming. He thought of Isabel, her nightmares, her fierce, broken pride. "No," Seth said, his voice quiet. "No?" the marshal asked. "It's not my story to tell," Seth said. "They're decent. They're good. What happened to them? It's theirs, not yours, not Hattie's, not this town's." Davies stared at him, his expression unreadable. He'd seen men lie, and he'd seen men tell the truth. This was something else. This was honor. It was a stupid, stubborn, and suicidal kind of honor. "Well," Hattie said, smoothing her coat, "that sounds like a confession to me. He's hiding it. Enjoy the gallows." "Seth," she swept out of the office. Davies sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Seth, you've left me no choice. I can't call off that posse with this. I've got to hold you. Put your gun on the desk. Slow." Seth did as he was told. He knew the look. The marshal's mind was made up. Davies took the gun and motioned to the cell in the back. "Until my men get back. With the girls, then we'll hear their story." Seth stepped into the cell. The marshal locked the heavy iron door. Seth was trapped, miles from the valley. As the sun began to set, back at the homestead, the silence was a living thing. 2 days had passed. Isabel was on edge, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. She cleaned the rifle for the 10th time. She paced. She watched the pass. Rose was trying to draw with Clara's charcoal, her movements frustrated. "It's too quiet. When is he coming back?" "He'll be back," Isabel said, the words sharp. "Go help Clara. She's sorting the beans." Clara was sitting at the table, a large bowl in her lap, her thin fingers picking stones from the dried beans, her movements slow and robotic. She was humming, the sound a high, thin thread of anxiety. Suddenly, Clara's humming stopped. She looked up, her head cocked, her eyes wide. "Isabel," she whispered. "What is it?" Isabel said, moving to the window. "A horse. I hear a horse." Isabel's heart leaped. "Seth, he was back." She moved to the door, her hand on the bar. She peered through the small crack in the shutter. It was not Seth. A man was at the edge of the clearing, just sitting on his horse, studying the cabin. He was big, wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat. Even from this distance, she could feel the menace. He had a long rifle resting across his saddle. "Get in the lean-to," Isabel hissed, her voice a blade. "Now, both of you." "But," Rose started. "Now, Rose." She shoved them both toward the lean-to door. "Bar it from the inside, and do not make a sound. No matter what you hear." Clara grabbed Rose's hand and pulled her in. The thud of the bar echoed in the cabin. Isabel was alone. She grabbed the rifle, her heart hammering against her ribs. She checked the load. She was terrified, but underneath the terror was the cold, hard rage she had felt before. This man, this was Jeb Stokes. This was the man who had haunted her nightmares. He had come. "I know you're in there, girls." His voice was a deep, oily bellow that cut through the cold air. "I've been watching. Saw your man ride out 2 days ago. He ain't coming back. He left you." He dismounted, slowly. "I've come for what's mine, my brother's property." He started to walk toward the cabin. Isabel raised the rifle, resting the barrel on the window frame. Her hands were shaking. "Squeeze. Don't pull. Let it come." Seth's voice was in her head. She aimed for his chest. She fired. The explosion filled the cabin. The rifle butt slammed into her shoulder. A familiar, painful punch. The man yelled, diving into the snow. The shot had missed, hitting the tree beside him. He was faster than he looked. "You bitch!" he roared from behind the woodpile. "You'll pay for that!" He was trapped, but so was she. He was patient. He would wait. He did not wait long. He had a plan. She saw him moving, keeping low, crawling toward the side of the cabin, toward the lean-to. He had seen her shoot from the front window. A new, colder terror seized her. Clara! Rose! She ran to the lean-to door. Clara! He's coming! He's at the side of the cabin! Get away from the wall! She heard a muffled scream from inside. Then, a scraping sound. He was trying to pry the lean-to door open. It was weaker than the main cabin door. Then she smelled it. Smoke, sharp and acrid. He had piled brush against the lean-to wall. He was lighting a fire. He was going to smoke them out, or burn them alive. Isabel! Clara's voice was a high, thin scream of panic. It's hot! The wall is hot! Isabel knew. In that instant, there was no more waiting. They had to move. Clara! She yelled, smashing the small window on the other side of the cabin, the one facing the creek. Get ready! I'm coming in! We're going out the window! She ran back to the lean-to door. She lifted the bar. She kicked the door open. The lean-to was filled with smoke. Clara and Rose were huddled by the far wall, coughing. Go! Isabel screamed, pushing them. Back to the cabin! Go! They scrambled into the main room. Isabel followed, barring the lean-to door again, but she knew it wouldn't last. The fire was raging now. The window, she said, her voice hoarse. Rose, you first. Go! Run to the creek. Hide in the rocks. Go! Rose scrambled through the broken window, her small body disappearing. Clara, you next. Clara was pale, her eyes wide with terror, but she was not frozen. She was moving. She started to climb through. At that exact moment, the lean-to door burst open. A wall of flame and smoke. Jeb Stokes stood there, framed in the fire, his face a mask of rage, his buffalo coat singed. There you are, he grinned, his teeth black. He saw Clara, silhouetted against the light of the window. He raised his pistol. Isabel screamed and lunged at him, but she was too far away. Clara, halfway through the window, saw him. She looked back, saw Rose cowering by the creek bank. She saw Stokes raising his gun. In one fluid motion, Clara shoved herself back into the cabin, pulling Rose's small form out of the line of fire. She threw her body in front of her sister. A human shield! No! She screamed. The gun fired. The sound was deafening. Clara collapsed, a dark stain spreading rapidly across her shoulder. Rose shrieked. Jeb Stokes laughed and took a step, leveling the pistol again, this time at Isabel. Isabel had the rifle. She had scooped it up as she ran. She saw Clara fall. She saw the blood. She saw the man, his face triumphant. The world went silent. The roaring of the fire, the screams, the wind, it all faded. There was only the man's face. Her hands were not shaking. They were rock solid. Her shoulder, already bruised, was ready. She raised the rifle. She did not aim. She just knew. She squeezed the trigger. The shot was clean. Jeb Stokes' eyes went wide with a profound, final surprise. The black grin vanished. He stumbled backward, clutched his chest, and fell, his body half in the fire, half out. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the flames and Rose's terrified sobs from outside. Isabel did not move for a full second. She just stood, the rifle smoking, the smell of gunpowder thick in her lungs. Then she dropped it and ran to Clara. Clara! Oh, God! Clara! She was on the floor, pale as the snow, her breathing shallow. The blood was everywhere. Rose! Isabel screamed. Get in here! Help me! Just as Rose scrambled back through the window, they heard it. Another horse, riding hard. Isabel grabbed the rifle, levering another round. She spun to the main door, her body a raw, coiled spring of protective rage. Get behind me, she hissed. The door flew open, and Seth stood there, his face a mask of pale terror. He must have seen the smoke from the pass. He had ridden his horse to death. He took in the scene, the body in the doorway, the cabin on fire, Clara on the floor, bleeding, Isabel covered in soot and blood, rifle in hand, looking like a goddess of vengeance. He did not speak. He moved. He ran to Clara. How bad? Her shoulder. He shot her. She saved Rose, Isabel sobbed, the strength finally leaving her. Get me my bag. The medical kit, now, he ordered. He ripped a strip of cloth from his shirt and pressed it hard against the wound. "It's high. It missed her heart. She's lost a lot of blood." He worked with a terrifying, gentle precision. He carried Clara to the main bed, which was away from the fire. He cut away the dress. He cleaned the wound. He pulled a needle and gut from his kit. "Isabel, hold the lamp. Hold it steady," he commanded. She did. Her hands, which had been so steady to kill, now trembled so badly she had to grip her own wrist. He stitched the wound, his large, scarred hands moving with the delicacy of a seamstress. Clara was unconscious, but she was breathing. When he was done, he sat back, his body slumping. He was covered in sweat and soot. Isabel just stood there, the lamp shaking. Then she crumpled. She fell to her knees, and the sobs, the ones she had held back since he left, tore out of her. "I'm sorry," she wept, the words incoherent. "I'm so sorry. I didn't trust you. I thought, He came to her. He knelt in front of her, pulling her into his arms, holding her head against his chest. "Shh," he whispered, his own voice thick. "It's all right. You're all right." He pulled back, his hands on her shoulders. He looked at her, his eyes full of an awe that stunned her. "You saved them," he said, his voice ragged. "He came, and you were ready. You saved them. Isabel, you didn't need me." They dragged Jeb Stokes' body out of the burning lean-to. The fire was dying, and had not caught the main cabin. Thanks to the snow, they did not bury him. The ground was iron. They dragged him to a clearing, piled the burned wood from the lean-to on top of him, and Seth lit the pyre. They stood and watched it burn, the flames lighting their grim, exhausted faces. When it was done, Seth took his axe and carved deep into the bark of a nearby pine, a warning to any who might follow. No more. Stokes. That night, the cabin was a wreck. Clara was sleeping, her fever high but her breathing steady. Rose was asleep at the foot of her bed, exhausted by terror. Seth and Isabel sat by the fire, the silence heavy, but no longer awkward. He was tending to her shoulder, the one she had fired the rifle with. It was a mass of dark purple bruises. "You're going to be sore for a week," he said, his fingers gently tracing the edge of the bruise. "I don't care," she whispered. She looked at the fire. When he was there, when he was raising his gun at Clara, I wasn't scared. She looked at him, her eyes clear and dark. I was just angry. I've never felt that before. I'm not afraid anymore. Seth," he stopped, his hand on her shoulder. He looked at her, at this woman of iron and fire, this woman who had faced down her own demons and won. "You were never weak, Isabel," he said, his voice soft. "You were just alone." He leaned in, and this time, there was no desperation. There was no fear. His kiss was slow and soft and certain. It was a promise. It was a vow. They made love that night not to chase away the darkness, but to celebrate the light. It was not a desperate clinging, but a slow, sure claiming. 2 days later, 2 riders appeared in the pass. Seth and Isabel met them in the clearing, rifles in hand, standing side by side. It was Marshal Davies and Silas, the trapper. The marshal dismounted, his eyes taking in the scene. He saw the burned-out lean-to. He saw the ominous blackened patch of the pyre. He saw the fresh, raw carving on the tree. "My God," Davies said, his gaze landing on Isabel. He had expected a cowering, used-up girl. He saw a queen. "He came, didn't he?" Davies said. "Jeb Stokes." "He came," Isabel said, her voice steady. "He's gone now." The marshal looked at Seth. I locked you up. Hattie, she was convincing." He looked down, ashamed. "Then Silas here. He rode in, told me what he knew. Told me you were a fool, but an honest one." Silas grinned. "Told him you were too stubborn to be a kidnapper. We rode out to find the posse," Davies said. We found them. Stokes had found them first. He doubled back. He killed 2 of them. Ambushed them. We realized what he was." He looked at Seth. "We were riding here. I was coming to let you go, to warn you. Looks like I was too late. We handled it, Seth said. Davies nodded. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It ain't much. It's my sworn statement, countersigned by Silas. It says the Stokes brothers were wanted. It says you acted in self-defense. And it says these 3 women are under your protection, wards of the court, with you as guardian. Free and clear. It clears your name. Seth. And theirs. It's the law. He handed the paper to Seth. Seth looked at it. Then he handed it to Isabel. She took the paper. She read the official, cramped writing. She saw the words, wards, protection, guardian, words that bound them, that made them official. She looked up. She looked at Clara, who was sitting on the porch, pale but alive, watching them. She looked at Rose, who was sitting beside her, holding her hand. She looked at Seth, who was standing next to her, his presence as solid as the mountains. This was their law. This was their proof. Slowly, deliberately, she folded the paper. She walked to the small fire Seth had built, and she dropped it in. They watched the edges curl, blacken, and turn to ash. The marshal stared, speechless. Isabel turned back, a small, sure smile on her face. "We don't need proof," she said. "We have each other." Spring did not arrive gently. It came like a victory, a sudden, violent melt that broke the back of the winter. The snows that had buried the valley for months receded in a matter of days, the creek rising to a deafening, muddy roar. The smell of wet earth and crushed pine, trapped for so long, rose like a perfume. Green, a color they had nearly forgotten, returned to the south-facing slopes. The thaw brought life, and it brought healing. Clara's shoulder mended, but it was a slow, painful process. The bullet had torn the muscle, and the long, ragged scar was a constant reminder. But as the warmth returned, Seth encouraged her to walk, to move, to use the arm. At first, she would only pace the porch, her face pale, her steps halting. Then, with Isabel on one side and Rose on the other, she made it to the corral. By the time the first wildflowers appeared, she was walking to the creek on her own, her vacant stare replaced by a sharp, watchful quiet. For Rose, the spring was a release. The cabin, once a fortress, had become a cage. The day the pass was finally clear of deep drifts, she burst from the door and just ran. She ran through the mud and the patches of remaining snow, her laughter echoing off the cliffs. A wild, joyous sound that made Isabel's heart ache. She was a child again, her cheeks flushed, her hair flying, her hands constantly full of strange rocks, shed antlers, and sticky buds. The burned-out lean-to was a scar, a black, ugly reminder of the night Jeb Stokes had come. It was the first thing Seth turned his attention to. "We need more room," he said one evening, his voice quiet. He had a piece of charcoal and a flat, clean piece of pine board, and he was sketching. A proper room, not a lean-to, with a good floor. "An extra room?" Isabel asked, looking over his shoulder. "For the girls," he said. "They need their own space, a place with a door that locks from the inside." He was not just building a room. He was building them their safety, their privacy. The work began. Seth rode out and returned, not with pelts, but with his horse laden with nails, window glass, and milled lumber for a proper door, traded for in Cheyenne. Marshal Davies had made his name good in the town, and men who had once crossed the street to avoid him now nodded, and even offered him credit. They built it together. He felled the trees, and she helped him peel the bark. He showed her how to notch the logs, how to mix the daubing from clay and straw. She was not just an assistant. She was his partner. She held the chalk line, her fingers steady. She learned to use the cross-cut saw, her muscles burning as she matched his rhythm, pulling and pushing, the bite of the teeth a satisfying, steady song. The sound of hammering echoed through the valley, a sound not of defense, but of creation. They worked from sunup to sundown, their bodies tired, their hands calloused. They fell into a rhythm of shared work that was more intimate than any touch. They spoke little, but they moved as one. One evening, they were sitting on the porch of the half-finished room, the air sweet with the smell of fresh-cut pine. The sun was setting, painting the high cliffs in shades of orange and purple. "Silas will be by next week," Seth said, his voice thoughtful. He's bringing the Millers with him. They've got a small spread over on the next rise, about 10 miles east." Isabel tensed. "Strangers. A family. They're good people," he said, sensing her fear. They want to say hello, to welcome you, to look at us," she whispered. "To meet their neighbors," he corrected gently. He looked at her, his face serious in the dying light. "The danger's past. Isabel, Stokes is gone. The law knows your name, and they've cleared it. You're free. You don't have to stay here." She looked at him, at this solid, quiet man who had offered her a rifle before he had offered her comfort. This man who had seen her at her lowest and had never once called her weak. "You could go to a town," he continued, the words costing him. You could start over, you and your sisters. You're young. You could find a decent life." She was silent for a long time, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "I used to think a new life meant a new place," she said, her voice soft. "That I had to wash all this off. All the fear, the shame." She turned to look at him. "I'm not staying. Seth." She saw the shadow pass over his face, a flicker of pain, of resignation. He thought she was leaving. "I'm choosing," she said. His head came up, his eyes searching hers. "Staying means you're just not leaving," she explained, her hand finding his, her fingers lacing with his. His hand was rough, calloused, and so wonderfully warm. "It means I'm here because I have nowhere else to go. That's how I was when I arrived. That's not how I am now." She squeezed his hand. Choosing means I'm planting my feet right here. It means I've seen the world, and this is where I want to be. This is my home. You are my home." He didn't speak. He just brought her hand to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers, and kissed her calloused knuckles. When Silas and the Millers arrived, Isabel was ready. She had baked bread. She wore her best dress, the one she had mended and washed a dozen times. Mr. Miller was a tall, thin man with a kind face, and his wife, Sarah, was round and shy, her hands twisted in her apron. Isabel stood on the porch of her new cabin, and she did not stand behind Seth. She stood beside him. She shook their hands, her grip firm. She poured the coffee, her hands steady. Sarah Miller looked at Clara, who was sitting on the porch steps, sketching in a small notebook Seth had bought her. "Your sister is quite the artist," she said, her voice soft. "Yes," Isabel said, her voice full of a pride that was fierce and new. "She is." They talked of the weather, of the elk herds, of the price of flour. They were normal, simple, decent words. And Isabel, who had once feared the judgment of strangers more than death, found herself laughing at one of Mr. Miller's stories. She was not the used-up girl from the brothel keeper's rumors. She was Mrs. McAllister, though no preacher had said the words. She was the mistress of the homestead, and as she watched them ride away, waving, she felt no fear, only peace. The sisters were finding their own paths. Rose, emboldened by the spring, became Seth's apprentice. She had learned to hunt, and now she wanted to ride. "Not on the buckskin with you," she insisted one morning, her chin set with a familiar stubbornness. "I want to ride on my own. I want my own horse." Seth looked at Isabel, who just shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. "She's as stubborn as you are," he said. He nodded at Rose. "All right, but you start with the mule, and you're responsible for it. You feed it, you brush it, you clean its stall every day, or you don't ride." Rose's whoop of joy echoed down the valley. Clara's healing was quieter and deeper. She had filled the notebook with sketches of Rose, of Seth, of Isobel's hands kneading dough. But her art had turned. She began to write. Silas had brought them a bundle of old newspapers from Cheyenne. In one, there was a small, clinical article about 2 other women who had been found on the prairie, despoiled and abandoned. Clara read it, her face pale. That night, she sat at the table for hours, the pen scratching in the lamplight. She was writing a letter. It was not to anyone in particular. It was to the mission in Cheyenne. It was to the marshal. It was to any woman who might read it. She told her story, not with names or places, but with feelings. She wrote of the fear and the silence and the shame, and then she wrote of the healing. She wrote, "You are not broken. You are not alone. You are a survivor, and you have a voice." She gave it to Silas on his next trip. Can you give this to someone? Someone who helps?" Silas read it, his weathered face grim. He nodded, folding it carefully and placing it in his breast pocket. "I will, child. I'll make sure it finds the right hands." Clara had found her purpose. She was turning her pain into a map, a light for other women lost in the same darkness. One clear morning, when the ground was soft and the air was warm, Isabel packed a small bag. "It's time," she said to Seth. He nodded. He knew. They rode south, just the 2 of them, the buckskin moving easily. They rode for a full day, back down the pass, back toward the world they had left behind. They found the land that had once been her family's farm. It was gone. The house had been burned, or torn down for lumber. The fields were overgrown with weeds. There was nothing left. Nothing, except the 3 small wooden crosses under the big oak tree. Her father, her mother, her baby brother, who had died of fever. The graves were a tangled mess of thorns and prairie grass. They worked in silence. Seth cut away the thorns, his knife sharp. Isabel pulled the weeds, her hands bare, clearing the earth. She had brought a small packet of seeds from Seth's stores, simple flower seeds. She pressed them into the dark, rich soil around the crosses. She did not cry. She had wept all her tears in the cabin, in the snow. Now, she just felt a quiet, profound sense of peace. She had said her goodbye. Seth stood back, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. He was her witness. He let her have her silence. When she was done, she stood, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her skirt. She looked at the graves, and then at the wide, empty land. "It's just land," she said, her voice quiet. "It's not home anymore." She turned and walked to the horse. Seth put his hat on, his hand resting on her back as she mounted. They rode north, back toward the high granite peaks, and they did not look back. That night, they sat on the porch of their finished cabin. The new room was sturdy, the door solid. The stars in the high mountain air were so bright, they looked like holes punched in the sky. "Thank you," Isabel whispered, her head resting on his shoulder. "For coming with me today." "I'll always go with you," he said, his voice a low rumble. She was quiet for a long time, listening to the sound of the creek, a sound that was no longer a threat, but a lullaby. "You saved us," she said, her voice thick. "That day, in the clearing, you saved our lives." He was silent, his arm tightening around her. "But you did more than that," she continued, her voice stronger. When you pushed me away, in the lean-to, when you didn't take, when you handed me the rifle, when you trusted me to be strong, you let me save myself." He was still for a long moment. He looked up at the vast, starry darkness. "I didn't rescue you, Isabel," he said, his voice rough. "You were always that woman, the one who stood up, bound and half-starved, and put herself between her sisters and a stranger with a gun. I just stood still long enough for you to rise." The high mountain air grew warmer. Summer settled into the valley, deep and green. The cabin was a home. One late afternoon, Isabel stood on the new porch, her hands resting on the rail. She was watching her sisters. Rose was in the corral, her small figure perched atop the mule, her face set in fierce concentration as Seth, standing in the middle, called out instructions. From the creek, she heard a sound she had not heard since before her father's death. It was Clara. She was sitting on a warm boulder, her feet in the water, her sketchbook in her lap. And she was laughing. It was a clear, bright sound, like a small bell. Rose had said something, and Clara was laughing. A deep, profound peace settled over Isabel. A peace so complete it felt like a physical weight. They were safe. They were whole. They were home. She smiled, her gaze soft. She turned her eyes toward the high peaks, her hand moving from the rail to rest, quiet and protective, on her own belly. She stood there, bathed in the warm, golden light of the late afternoon, hopeful, and waiting for the life that was still growing inside. Thank you for listening to our story. We truly hope you enjoyed this tale from the heart of the American West. We love hearing from you. So please, leave a comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from. And if you want more stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, From Wild West. We'd be obliged if you'd share your thoughts with us in English. We read every one. Until next time, stay safe, and thank you for your support.